She turned down 3 marriage proposals in 10 years, waiting for a man the whole town said was never coming back. Now this here tale comes from a time when the West was still wild and a man's word meant everything under that burning sun. It's a story about waiting, about promises kept in the silence of lonely nights, and about a love that refused to die even when the world tried its hardest to bury it. His name was Samuel Creed, and folks around the Cimarron Valley knew him as a man of few words and steady hands. He rode into that territory back in the spring of 1872, nothing more than a drifter with dust on his boots and ghosts in his eyes. But what he found in that small town of Copper Ridge would change everything he thought he knew about himself. Her name was Clara Winslow, and she worked at her father's general store, stacking shelves and keeping books with numbers so neat they could make a banker weep. She had hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes green as the first grass after winter's thaw. When Samuel walked through that door looking for supplies, he forgot every item on his list. He forgot his own name for a moment, standing there like a fool while the afternoon light caught her just right. Now, love in those days didn't announce itself with fancy words or elaborate gestures. It crept up on a person quiet-like, the way dawn eases over the mountains. Samuel started finding reasons to visit that store more than any reasonable man should. He needed coffee, he needed rope, he needed matches. What he needed, truth be told, was just to hear her voice. Clara saw through him from the start, of course. Women always do, but instead of sending him away with embarrassment, she smiled that particular smile that told him she didn't mind one bit. They started talking, first about weather and cattle prices, then about deeper things, dreams they held close, fears they'd never spoken aloud, family they'd lost along the way. By summer's end, Samuel had worked up enough courage to ask her father's permission to court her properly. Old Henry Winslow was a hard man, shaped by years of frontier living, but even he could see something genuine in the young cowboy's eyes. He gave his blessing with a firm handshake and a warning that carried weight. Those months that followed were the sweetest Samuel ever knew. Sunday picnics by the creek where cottonwoods whispered secrets to the wind. Evening walks along the main street when the sun painted everything gold. Stolen moments behind the store where they held hands and spoke of the future they'd build together. But the frontier had a way of interrupting happiness, and fate came calling one October morning wearing the face of a man named Garrett Cole. Cole was wanted in 3 territories for crimes that don't bear repeating in polite company. He rode into Copper Ridge with 5 men at his back and darkness in his heart. When the local sheriff tried to stand against them, they put him in the ground before noon. The town had no one else willing or able to fight. Samuel had been a lawman once, back in Kansas, before tragedy drove him west seeking escape. He'd buried that part of himself deep, hoping it would stay forgotten. But when Cole's men started terrorizing the townspeople, threatening Clara and her father among them, something old woke up inside him. What happened next, folks still talk about when they gather around fires on cold nights. Samuel faced Cole and his gang alone in the street, and when the dust settled and the echoes faded, 6 outlaws lay defeated. But Cole, wounded and desperate, had friends across the border, dangerous friends who would come seeking vengeance. Samuel made a decision that would haunt him for a decade. He told Clara he had to leave, had to draw that danger away from Copper Ridge, away from her. She begged him to stay, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She said they could face anything together. But Samuel knew better. He'd seen what men like Cole's associates did to the people their enemies loved. He couldn't risk her life, not for anything in this world. The night before he left, they stood together under stars that seemed close enough to touch. He made her a promise, spoke words that came from somewhere deeper than his throat. "I'll come back to you, Clara. When this is finished, when I know you'll be safe, I'll ride back into this town and I'll never leave again. Wait for me if you can. But if you can't, I'll understand. A man has no right to ask a woman to put her life aside for uncertainty. She pressed something into his hand. A silver locket that had belonged to her mother, with a small photograph of herself inside. She made him promise to keep it close, to remember what waited for him at the end of whatever road he traveled. Then Samuel Creed rode into the darkness, and the years began their long, slow march. He tracked Cole's associates across territories and through seasons. Some he brought to justice through courts of law. Others met their end in confrontations they started and couldn't finish. The work was hard and lonely, and there were nights when Samuel wondered if he was chasing ghosts, while his life slipped away like water through open fingers. He kept that locket against his heart through everything, through blizzards that nearly took his life in Montana, through fever that laid him low for weeks in a small Arizona town, through moments of despair when he questioned every choice he'd ever made. Word reached him sometimes about Copper Ridge. The town was growing, prospering. Henry Winslow's store had expanded, and Clara, the letters told him, had turned down 3 proposals of marriage from respectable men who could have given her a good life. She was waiting, they said, still waiting. The years carved themselves into Samuel's face, threading silver through his dark hair and etching lines around his eyes. He was no longer the young drifter who'd ridden into Copper Ridge that spring day. He was something harder now, tempered by experience and solitude. But beneath all that weathering, his heart remained unchanged. It took 10 years to finish what he'd started. 10 years of tracking, fighting, and surviving. When the last of Cole's network finally faced justice in a courtroom in Denver, Samuel stood outside and felt something release in his chest. Something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten its weight. He rode west the next morning. The journey to Copper Ridge took 3 weeks, and with each mile, Samuel felt the years trying to settle on his shoulders. Doubt crept in like evening shadows. Would she still be there? Would she even recognize him? Did he have any right to expect her to have waited when he'd given her permission to move on? That silver locket felt heavy against his chest as he crested the final ridge and saw the town spread below him in the valley. Copper Ridge had indeed grown. New buildings lined the main street. A church steeple rose where there had been only empty lots. Children played in the streets, and the sounds of prosperity drifted up on the warm afternoon air. Samuel rode in slow, his heart beating like war drums in his ears. People stopped to stare at the stranger, not recognizing the young man they'd known in this weathered rider. He didn't blame them. Some days he barely recognized himself. The general store had a new facade, fresh paint the color of spring cream. A sign announced it as Winslow and Daughter Mercantile. Samuel tied his horse at the rail and stood there for a long moment, summoning courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The bell above the door announced his entrance, same as it had 10 years before. She stood behind the counter, and time collapsed into nothing. There was silver in her autumn hair now, threads of winter woven through the wheat. Lines had gathered at the corners of those green eyes, maps of years lived through joy and sorrow both. But the soul behind those eyes, the essence that had captured Samuel's heart a decade past, remained unchanged. Clara looked up, ready with a merchant's greeting. Then she saw him. The ledger fell from her hands, pages scattering like startled birds. Her palm pressed against her heart, and tears welled instantly, spilling over without resistance. She didn't speak, she couldn't. Samuel crossed the distance between them, boots loud on the wooden floor, and stopped just short of the counter. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out the locket. It caught the light silver dulled by years and handling, but still whole. "I promised," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I promised I'd come back." Clara came around that counter like the years were nothing, and then she was in his arms, and Samuel finally understood what home meant. She was trembling, or maybe he was, or maybe both of them together. "I knew you would," she whispered against his chest. "I always knew." They stood that way for a long while, two people reunited after a decade of separation, holding tight to each other as if the world might try to pull them apart again. Outside, life in Copper Ridge continued its ordinary rhythms. Wagons rolled past, dogs barked, children laughed. But inside that store, time stood sacred and still. Later, they would have conversations that lasted through nights. Samuel would tell her about the years of hunting, the dangers faced, the moments when hope had dimmed almost to nothing. Clara would tell him about the waiting, about the proposals refused, about the faith she'd held onto when everyone told her she was foolish. Later, there would be a wedding in that new church with the white steeple, witnessed by townspeople who remembered the young cowboy and celebrated his return. There would be years of ordinary happiness, the kind that doesn't make legends but means everything to those living it. But in that moment, all that mattered was this: two hearts that had never stopped beating together, finally united after a decade apart. A promise made and a promise kept. A love that had outlasted time and distance and every obstacle the frontier could throw against it. The West was full of stories, friends. Tales of outlaws and lawmen, of gold and glory, of triumph and tragedy. But every now and then, you'd hear one about something simpler, something that reminded folks why they kept going, kept hoping, kept believing in better days ahead. This was one of those stories, the story of a cowboy who rode away and a woman who waited, and how after 10 years they found each other again. And if you happened to pass through Copper Ridge in the years that followed, you might just see them. An older couple walking the evening streets hand in hand, still looking at each other like that first day never ended. Some loves, you see, are simply meant to last forever.